Hello there, and welcome back to Void War Studios, everyone. It occurs to me that I have not talked about Warhammer Fantasy in quite a while, and I want to get into a little bit more of the story, particularly pertaining to the fact that, well, Games Workshop at some point have promised to re-release Warhammer Fantasy under the new title of Warhammer the Old World. And they've even said roughly the time period that they're going to quote-unquote start the game from, this being the First Great Chaos Incursion. So our Emperor of the Empire at this point is known as Magnus the Pious. So, what I'd like to do in this video is I want to start from the very beginning and go through the history of the Old World leading up to this Great War against Chaos. Because this will be our stepping point into the Warhammer Fantasy world, I'm going to do my best to not overcomplicate this video. So I'm not going to go into massive amounts of detail over every single faction and character because, well, frankly, keeping the main story on track is going to be really hard as it is, because there are so many side stories with various races, factions, and forces at play here that, yeah, to try and stay on the main point is difficult. But like all great grand stories, there is an overriding story, it's just that it gets kind of murky beneath all the other flavourful stories that go on top of it. I think our best place to start with is going to be with the Lizardmen of Lustria. These were the earliest and original servants of the Old Ones. Through powers of magic and science, the Lizardmen were created and essentially used to help shape the Warhammer world. They instructed the Lizardmen to essentially eradicate any races that appeared that were outside of the Great Plan, as it was called, and in doing so they gave Lizardmen the Sauros Warriors, creatures that would eat and destroy anything that the Old Ones designed as not fit to survive, or at the very least incompatible with their future goals.
And at this point in time, there were certainly many creatures on the Warhammer world that were not created by the Old Ones, as well as an annoying menace known as Greenskins, the Orc and Goblin race who would prove to be one hell of a menace for the entire lifetime of the Warhammer Fantasy universe.
And during all this, whilst the Saurus Warriors and Slann were happily shaping the Warhammer world, the Old Ones frequently used what were known at the time as polar gateways, two large constructs which essentially allowed them to pop in and out of the cosmos. It's not very well explained, it's not very well talked about, but essentially it was a way for the Old Ones to instantaneously travel across the universe. And whilst they were doing that, they were creating more Slann to essentially enact their plans on the Warhammer world. And they instructed the Lizardmen to build huge temple cities, each one forming a point that became a nexus to what essentially was called the Geomantic Web. It was a magical barrier of sorts that encompassed the planet and essentially helped keep everything all stable. And in addition to this, each one of these temples became a focal point for large quantities of, well, magical energy, which the Slann could take advantage of whenever they wanted to do any spells. Stick a Slann on top of their temple cities and they're practically mini gods in their own right. And so long as each one of these temple cities remained linked and connected, all the Slann could telepathically communicate with one another at vast distances. Now this was fine, initially, and it was some point during this time that the elves, dwarves, and men were created. It's a little unclear, but this is roughly the time when most of the Warhammer races are, well, born. But everything kind of goes to shit real fast when our four favourite friends turn up who you never want to turn up to any party. The Chaos Gods. Now, what essentially happened is the Polar Gates were essentially an entryway for the Chaos Gods and their minions to, well, saturate the Warhammer world in chaos energy. And this energy swarmed across the planet, causing mutations and horrendous abominations to be born out of nothing, maddening areas of complete bonkersness, and it just saturated the entire Warhammer world, causing all kinds of insanity to go on. It is at this point that we become aware that the Beastmen enter into the story. Humans who have been racked by the magic of chaos becoming these new amalgamations of beast and man, completely devoted to the Chaos Gods and living with an undying hatred towards anything involving civilization.
It is also during this time that the Chaos Dwarves become an actual race. Dwarves who had gone far into the east and had no gods to protect them and no holes deep enough to shield them from the worst of the chaotic magic. It is around this period, as far as we're aware, of the first ever Skaven appearing in the Warhammer world as well, coming from the very well hidden city of Skavenblight, from one of the earliest human civilizations. Ogres are assumed to be one of the races created just before the Polar Gates opened, believed to be a kindred race of the Halflings. The reason for this is that both these races have a resistance to chaotic corruption. However, because of the ogres' level of stupidity and mad desire to eat everything they find, they are considered an experiment that was rushed before the Old Ones had to leave. And the ogres became the warlike, violent, and extraordinarily dangerous race they are known for today.
And in addition to the moon that was originally there, much like our own moon, there was now also a giant green sphere made entirely of warpstone that was forever known as Morslib. And Morslib is responsible for all kinds of bad things happening, because essentially it's a moon of pure chaotic magic.
Put simply, if Morslib is on the rise, really bad magical craziness is going to happen. Think the undead trying to stir from their tombs, rat men going a bit bananas, chaos warriors wanting to sacrifice people to get the attention of their gods.
Yeah, it's a moon of ill omen, shall we say, and not one you ever want to be circling your planet. And with the Old Ones gone, the Slann were kinda leaderless for a while and essentially were only able to shrink the Chaos Gates down enough so that not quite as many demons were spilling through as fast. The Lizardmen had no choice but to retreat to their temple cities, knowing that the Old Ones had told them essentially to never ever let them fall, or the geomantic matrix will become corrupted and unable to prevent the planet from essentially blowing to pieces. Yeah, kind of important that. So they decided to hold up in their temple cities and fight the demons as best as they could. However, even doing this killed vast quantities of their number. Almost half of their number were killed in this attempt. And despite this, the world was so saturated in magic that demons came through and, well, started causing shit everywhere they went. Dwarves, elves, men had to flee, hide, or do their best to weather the storm as much as they could. And it was only really with the aid of the various races' gods, who strangely appear around this time. We'll get into that in another day, but essentially powerful heroes and figures of myth and legend rose during this time period and essentially battled the hordes of chaos. And it was only thanks to a combination of the elves, dwarves and lizardmen who were able to seal off the chaos gates, the elves stabilizing the magical energy of the world by creating what was known as the Great Vortex, which essentially worked like a filter. All the magic that was coming into the world through the chaos gates was sucked into this vortex, and it came out again as purified magic, per se. And in addition to this, it helped lower the level of background magic in the world. You can kind of think of this magic as radiation of sorts. I've referred to it a bit like this in the past, but essentially this allowed, well, frankly, it allowed other races to live, not warping and mutating them left, right and centre. But thanks to this, in combination with the Lizardmen's temple cities maintaining the barrier, magical energy started being drawn more and more away from the Warhammer world, making it harder and harder for the demonic forces to manifest, and thereby giving the races a fighting chance. It is after the sacrifice of many great heroes from both the Lizardmen, Dwarf and Elven race that the Warhammer world was made relatively stable again. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was irrevocably damaged from the warping powers of chaos. At least you could walk down to your local grocery, come back with food that wasn't, smiling at you and wanting to eat your face, but also you wouldn't be a mutated pile of goo on the ground. But this is now a world where all kinds of weirdness can happen, thanks to the warping powers of chaos. After this incursion with chaos, that the elves and dwarves expanded their empires. There was a friendship, at least in the beginning, between these different races. The elves may look down on the dwarves, literally and figuratively, and the dwarves may think that the elves are hoity-toity and a bit up their own bums, but there was a mutual friendship and trust built during the wars against chaos and the hatred of the demon. And during this time period, there was a kind of peace. Now, don't get me wrong, there were still now human tribes who worshipped the chaos powers, beast men, dragons, and orcs wandering around all over the place, but comparatively speaking, the Elven and Dwarven empires had become now so mighty and so large that these were relatively minor threats. But like all things in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, this budding friendship between elf and dwarf could not last long. What could have once been the most mighty bulwark against chaos began with an elf named Malekith. Now, I will get into his own story in the Dark Elf video, but the long story short is that the elves have themselves a civil war between Malekith and Calador I. This war went on for almost 2,000 years. The elves were clearly not in that much of a hurry.
It is at some point during this War of the Beard that a group of Dark Elves are driven way off course by a storm, landing in the lands of Khemri, where an up-and-coming priest of the mortuary cult of Khemri, Nagash, manages to torture them and learn the secrets of sorcery, and discovers ways and means to help extend his life far, far, far beyond that of any mortal, as well as learning how to raise the dead for his own nefarious purposes. It is thanks to Nagash that you have the lovely vampire counts. But the conclusion of this is quite a ways off, so back to the elves.
At the very end of the war, that was forever known as the Sundering, Malekith tried to disrupt the vortex that kept the Warhammer world from imploding and the raw stuff of chaos from spreading over the land again, and was trying to use it as a kind of a screw you move to the High Elves. However, what ended up happening was that he was prevented, but the backlash of the spell sank a portion of the island into the ocean. From this point on, the Dark Elves fled with what cities that they had that floated, known as arks, and made their way towards the lands of Lustria, across the Great Ocean, and settled in what they now called Nagaroth, and this is where the Dark Elves now live. This war was kept as secret as possible from the rest of the outside world, as the Elves did not want anyone interfering or running the risk that the Dark Elves would get allies from outside involved in their fights. It was not long after this that the Dark Elves decided to thoroughly ruin what was once a great friendship. A series of dwarven caravans were raided and the merchants were killed, and evidence was left suggesting that the High Elves were involved. The dwarven king Starbreaker, who was considered a very measured dwarf, sent emissaries to the High Elves to demand recompense for these crimes, not knowing, unfortunately, that there was a faction of elves who were actively encouraging this war with the dwarves. The High Elven king at the time was
known as Calador II,
a bit of an arrogant individual, and was insulted at the insinuation that the High Elves had broken their treaties with the dwarves and were ambushing their caravans. As an insult to them, he shaved their beards and kicked them out of his court. And it was at this point that the dwarves and elves decided that this could not be borne, and the Great War, the World War, against elves and dwarves began. And in this war that lasted for 400 years, the Warhammer Fantasy world was irrevocably ravaged. Once again, the magic of the elves being thrust against the defensive power and runes of the dwarves, dragons versus runesmiths, runic weapons versus elven silvered steel. It was total carnage all across the Warhammer world. And eventually, finally, on the shores of the Old World, Calador II was killed under the feet of Gotrek Starbreaker himself, who took his phoenix crown for vengeance on all those who had been dishonoured by the elves, and the dwarves swore that never again would such friendship ever be possible with an elf. Elves fled back to their home, where even more calamities were to befell them, and the dwarves retreated back to their mountain homes, only to find that enemies from within and around had grown strong in their absence. Orcs, goblins, skaven, and beastmen grew into vast hordes that the dwarves were no longer mighty enough to stop, and with no help from the elves, the Dwarven Empire shrank and became but a shadow of its former self.
An additional casualty for the High Elven forces are that those who refused to return to Ulthuan hid themselves in the forested areas of the Warhammer world, most numerous of which were the elves who resided within Athol Loren, as its natural magical defences meant it was not a place that the dwarves would willingly try to pursue them in, and thus were the Wood Elves born, the race of elves now thoroughly divided. It is at some point after the War of the Beard that Nagash realizes that with enough warpstone he can enact what he described as the Great Ritual Awakening, where he would use his powers, that vastly extended beyond that of any mortal human, to essentially kill all life in the Warhammer world and resurrect them as animated undead, all under his control, and a serious threat to the entire world. It is only thanks to a combined effort of the Skaven and Al-Khadizar who managed to kill Nagash's form, and, well, whilst he's not dead, at the very least banish him for another 1,000 years. However, the ritual was successful enough that it killed everything within the kingdom of Khemri, and raised it up as undead skeletons. But the strangest part was that on Nagash's death, these skeletons retained their sentience, or at least those who had been embalmed the most skillfully retained their intelligence, their own will, and this became the Tomb Kings in the land of the dead. And now for the most significant next event, we jump forward 1,020 years to the birth of Sigmar. Sigmar Heldenhammer, possibly the most influential figure in Warhammer Fantasy, rescues the Dwarven king Kurgan Ironbeard from orcs, and as a token of his appreciation, as humans at this point are still relatively simplistic and barbaric, Kurgan Ironbeard gifted him the rune hammer Gal Maraz, and the beginnings of a beautiful friendship was forged. And after a climactic battle where the Greenskins were finally driven out of the old world, this being the area known as the World Edge Mountains, the Empire and later Bretonnia, this is where the true beginning of human civilization really starts, as once the Emperor was crowned, he set about commissioning the Dwarven smith Alric the Mad to create runefang swords, each sword belonging to a elector count, or chief at the time of a particular area of these established lands. It is also around about this time that the Bretonians found themselves, and go through many fun battles as the tasks of Giles le Breton forges the kingdom of Bretonia. Jump forward nearly 1,000 years, where Sigmar is openly worshipped as a god, and the Bretonian kingdom is thoroughly established. The Empire is, well, disorganized in the midst of civil war, and basically things are kind of going to hell in a handbasket. Skaven are wandering across, or underneath, almost every established settlement across the world. Orcs are rampaging everywhere. The Empire has only barely managed to survive a war with the vampire counts, and chaos is on the rise, coming down to completely decimate all of civilization. And that is where our story begins, at least based on what we know so far from the Old World announcement way back when. I hope this video has been relatively informative, and like I said, I tried to keep the details relatively brief for each faction because there is a ridiculous amount of detail I could go into, and we wouldn't have a very consistent story if I did. Hopefully you'll have understood enough to get the general gist of the story so far. Thank you all very much for watching. Thank you for 210 subscribers. That is crazy and awesome, and I love you all for it, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Until next time, take care everyone.